Arbites. Arbites. Arbites? Arbites. Arbites. Okay, let's talk about Adeptus Arbites. In the grim darkness of the far future, all cops really are. The Adeptus Arbites is 40k's space police, and I've always had a bit of a soft spot for them, which is a bit strange as I'm really not into police stuff. I generally think an authoritarian paramilitary police force is a bad idea, but then doing all the bad ideas is kind of what 40k is. What I am really into is all the behind-the-scenes stuff in the 40k setting, all the civilian life that people like Dan Abnett write about so well. And as a paramilitary police force, the Adeptus Arbites is one of those organisations that crosses over between the civilian world and the tabletop games quite often. In this video, I'm going to take a look at what the Arbites does and how that's developed over the years, both in the background and in the game. Full disclosure, I've already written way too much. I was going to do a model comparison, but I might save that for another video, along with a more in-depth look at the Necromunda rules. For now, let's start at the start. The Adeptus Arbites are part of 40k from the very beginning, appearing in 1987's Rogue Trader. But if you want to find out where they came from, we have to look a bit earlier than that. In the mid-80s, Games Workshop used to produce rules and models for other licensed IP, and in 1985 they released the Judge Dredd role-playing game, along with a line of Citadel miniatures. 2000 AD, the magazine Judge Dredd appeared in, had been going since 1977 and was pretty big in the mid-80s, and its satirical style had a huge influence on early 40k, so it shouldn't be surprising that scary future police empowered to act as judge, jury and executioner made their way into the Imperium. In Rogue Trader, planets are largely self-policing. The Adeptus Arbites exists to enforce galaxy-wide Imperial law, like maintaining the tithe. A planet might have one small squad of arbitrators to assist the Imperial governor in watching for rebellion or ensuring compliance. Like Megacity 1 judges, they wear a padded body glove of mesh armour. In early 40k, mesh is just the level between flak and carapace. And they have a simplified and significantly less pointy version of the Custodes helm, which is full of communications equipment. Apparently, the full uniform includes this 50s style police cape, which strangely never made its way into the model range. At this point, there were no shotguns or grenade launchers. Arbiters used bolt pistols and bolt guns. But their stats were pretty good. Weapon skill and ballistic skill 4, strength 4, good human champion stats, and in some ways stronger than a Space Marine. Though Space Marines at the time were more hypnotised psychopaths than 8-foot-tall warrior monks. The original model release consisted of 3 sculpts by Jez Goodwin, a bolter, a shotgun, and a power maul guy that isn't explicitly called a sergeant, but he does have these fancy eagle shoes, so we can only assume. That's pretty much everything released about them during the Rogue Trader years. They don't even have an army list entry in any of the usual places. The Book of the Astronomicon in 1988 includes an Adeptus Arbites section, but the 2 characters within it, Stujan Deathwalker and Mojan Piet, are more penal legion officers than arbitrators. The point where a lot of the Adeptus Arbites fluff solidifies is during the 90s, starting with the 2nd edition box set. 2nd edition was a complete reset from Rogue Trader, so the box included get-you-by army lists for all the models available, a bit like the 8th edition index books. In Codex Imperialis, the background book, the Adeptus Arbites section concerns itself mostly with the scale of the organisation, how the Lex Imperia is housed in the Hall of Judgment on Terror, and how 100 volumes are added to its number every day. The book also separates judges out from arbitrators, describing the arbitrators as the military arm of the judges. And the accompanying short story, where massively hatted Marshal of the Court Androclas suspects rebellion, has him astropathically informing the judges to get backup. The accompanying get-you-by army list includes rules for including both in your Imperial armies. The judge is a pretty standard high-level human character, though armed with a power sword, which is obviously wrong. But by this point, the Arbitrator squad is a bit more recognisable. They have standard human stats with carapace armour and the shotguns and bolt guns we'd expect. They also get access to power mauls and suppression shields for the first time. New models were released in January 1994, with rules in White Dwarf 169, though they were overshadowed in that by the exciting release of these hobgoblin sneaky gits for Warhammer Fantasy. So sneaky they waved around this special banner to announce it. The background makes them a bit more scary, a grim and uncompromising reminder of the Imperium's presence which no planetary governor could ignore. I really like this little box out.
They lived there in that great plascrete tower surrounded by walls and razor wire, only emerging to seize some unfortunate who's transgressed against Imperial laws or patrol the city to prove that it belongs to them. There are crystal lenses and sound wave detectors on that tower that can watch citizens and listen to their conversations 100 leagues away. Imperial spy satellites watch what they can't see directly, and even the governor fears them. They aren't from here and have nothing to do with us, no more than Orcs or Eldar. If they have families or children, we don't know about them and we don't care. They wouldn't so much as buy a glow bulb from us and we wouldn't sell it to them. It's ironic that they have the rather benevolent title of Arbitrators.
There's the now familiar line about renegade commanders going after the Arbiters precinct first, so the Arbitrators are deliberately better equipped than the PDF. This article has the first sighting of the Arbiters' combat shotgun and executioner ammo, a heat-seeking shell that could fire around corners at hidden targets. The army list entry also includes the option to mount the squad on bikes or give them mauls and shields, but there are no models for that. The new sculpts, again by Jez Goodwin, included 4 models: bolt gun, shotgun, grenade launcher, and a champion. These are probably the most iconic Arbiters models. They're chunkier and more heavily armoured than the previous release, which might have pulled them away from the Judge Dredd influence if it wasn't for the new eagle shoulder pad and chin helmet. Also in 1994, the Citadel Miniatures Modelling Guide featured an article on how to build this open-topped Adeptus Arbites Rhino by Adrian Wild. It's cute. The next outing for the Arbiters is in the October-November 97 issue of the Citadel Journal. The Journal was a really interesting publication released by Games Workshop through mail order in the 90s. It's something I'd quite like to make a video about. It was a magazine of house rules that Games Workshop staff and fans could submit work to. Issue 22 featured the Covert X campaign by Wulfric, Richard Galland, a Games Workshop editor at the time. It's a mini-campaign in which a force of Space Marine scouts attempts to infiltrate an Imperial world. The Precinct 13 Arbitrator list in this remains the only actual Adeptus Arbites list Games Workshop have ever published. And it has some really interesting rules. For example, the Arbitrators always fight on home turf, so they can call for backup during the game and get free units by spending their victory points. The new units arrive in a random number of turns on a random board edge depending on how fast they are. There's a bit more background in which marshals, inspectors and proctors are the ranks within the precincts, and judges are high-ranking roaming officers. The army list includes side detectives, shock squads with mauls and shields, and castigators, which are sisters of battle immolators with heavy webbers on top. Of course, how official all this is questionable, but it's interesting that a lot of these ideas are still floating around in fan codexes to this day. Around this time, the Arbitrators make their first appearance in Necromunda, originally as a White Dwarf article and later in the Battles in the Underhive book. We get the usual fluff that on Necromunda the houses keep their own peace, so the judges might only be in the Underhive to search for Archaeotech or hunt down heretics. It gives rules for running the 2nd edition Arbitrator squad as a playable gang, and simplifies a lot of the standard gang rules since Arbiters don't really care about territory or the trading post. The Battles in the Underhive book also included these Arbiters conversions by Mike McVeigh, including this classic Chimera-style APC. 3rd edition 40k was released in 1998, another complete reset which invalidated a lot of these rules. And the Adeptus Arbites starts a shift from the battlefield to the background. Games Workshop released the Inquisitor game in 2001, which was a 54mm narrative skirmish game with some role-playing elements. Each player controlled an Inquisitor and their retinue, which included an option for Enforcers. As well as representing Arbitrators and local law enforcement, this adds a new thing: Enforcers of the Inquisition. Often known as wards or protectors, these are recruited and armed by the Inquisition itself from amongst the most faithful and resolute peoples of the Imperium. The wards can be brought in to enforce an Inquisitor's rulings, replacing local security forces or the Arbiters, providing kill teams and execution squads, and lending their firepower to purges and witch hunts. The initial model release for this was Special Security Enforcer Barbaretta and her Cybermastiff, and they were followed by a limited edition Adeptus Arbites Judge. The Inquisitor game wasn't very popular, and it was overshadowed by its own tie-in fiction. Commissioned to write an Inquisition-based novel to support the release, Dan Abnett wrote Xenos, the first book in what became the Eisenhorn trilogy. These books have sold a lot more than Inquisitor ever did, and they're still considered one of the best ways to get into the 40k background. One of the main characters in the Eisenhorn books is Chastener Godwin Fishig of the Hubris Arbiters, though in the 3 books he appears in it's never really explained what a Chastener does, maybe just telling people off. The next mention we get in the 40k game is the 2003 Witch Hunters Codex. which dealt with the Ordo Hereticus and the Sisters of Battle. Under the troops entry for Inquisitorial Stormtroopers, we get this designer's note. The Ordo Hereticus often call on the Adeptus Arbites to aid them in their work, using them to round up known criminals and screen them for signs of deeper corruption. Hence, Inquisitorial Stormtrooper squads may be used to represent squads of Adeptus Arbites by replacing each trooper's hellgun and targeter with a shotgun at no extra cost. In reality, this was a bad deal. Shotguns were way worse than a hellgun and targeter. But otherwise, this is the stat line we kind of still think of when we think of Arbites, the standard human veteran stat line that Scions, Guard Vets, and Sisters of Battle share. Also in 2003, Black Library released Crossfire by Matthew Farrer, which becomes the first in a trilogy of novels focused on the Adeptus. Like many off-battlefield novels, this does a really good job of fleshing out how the Arbites actually functions, away from the grand scale of the previous fluff. The lead character, Shira Calpurnia, is a newly promoted Arbiter General, recently transferred to the Hydrofer system, and she has to adjust to a role which has less locking perps in the isocubes and more ceremony and diplomacy. Don't worry, she still gets to lock perps and isocubes. Like every Arbites release, the rank structure is rewritten. Arbiter General seems to be a title applied to a number of ranks. She's one of 3 Arbiters Senioris, and they report to the Arbiter Major, though all 3 are called Arbiter Generals. The book also defines judges as a sort of career track within the Adeptus. After reaching a certain rank, an arbitrator might specialise in either legal or paramilitary arms, the legal arm being progression along a judge path. The books feature some lovely ideas. This is the first time we see things like Verispex adepts, who are like a forensics department, as well as Arbites chaplains and medici, and the first definition of what a chastener actually does. It's an arbiter that specialises in interrogation, torture and discipline. Not sure how much of that Abnet had in mind when writing Fishig. It's the little things in this book that I like. For instance, Arbites rhinos are for transporting troops inside, not criminals. When they catch a criminal, they put them in a sort of straitjacket and just hang them from a hook on the side of the vehicle. The books also feature a really good look at Imperial daily life, religious ceremonies, how organisations like astropaths and rogue traders really function. They're really worth a read. In 2004, in Fanatic magazine, the Necromunda Enforcers make their first appearance. This is for Necromunda Underhive, the 2nd edition of the game. We've always heard about the split between local law enforcement and the Arbites, but this is the first time we actually see it. The Enforcers of Necromunda are the local police force who serve Lord Helmore, and they have precinct houses all over the Hive. Much like the Imperial Guard and Cadians, the equipment of the Necromunda Enforcers is heavily modified of that on the Arbitrators, which is really handy if you're trying to build an Arbites army. The models released here kind of look like slightly smaller 90s Arbitrators, with a more minimal Imperialis on the shoulder instead of the big gold eagle. This and their cruder, more slab-like armour actually moves them a little further away from Judge Dredd. As per all Necromunda gangs of the era, they come as a set of 8 monopose metal models, including a leader, a heavy, and a few variant enforcers with interchangeable weapons that fit on any of the models. The set also included a Cyber Mastiff and Handler, obviously modelled after the 54mm Robo-Dog. In game terms, they're not quite as scary as the 1st edition Arbitrator gangs, but they have a bit more flexibility. Initially released in 2008 by Black Industry and later by Fantasy Flight Games, the Dark Heresy role-playing game is the next big source of information. The game contains an arbitrator class, and we get loads of really nice art of individual arbitrators. These Fantasy Flight game books are beautifully designed, and it's worth getting your hands on them just to have a look at the art alone. The same general themes are repeated in the background, but they're a bit more personal, with more hooks for role-playing games. The book talks about whole sectors falling to seditious or criminal organisations, and how it's the role of the Arbites to stop this disruption to the Imperial status quo. The career track in the game broadly mirrors the Calpurnia books. Your character progresses to a full arbitrator and then picks either a combat track ending in Lord Marshal or a judicial track. The Book of Judgment expansion in 2011 fleshes all this out further. It's a complete guide to how the different Arbites forces work in the Calixis sector, with the idea that the whole party might be somehow involved in law enforcement. Verispecs, Chasteners, Grapplehawks and Cybermastiff programmers are all present, and there's some great colour text. It's not the simple physical scale of a crime that decides whether it's a matter for the Arbites or whatever mundane justice system the local governor has seen fit to set up. Rather, it is at whom or what the act was directed. A brawl between gangs of rakes in the upper streets of the Hive is beneath the Arbites' notice. A handful of murders in that brawl would be treated no differently, worth a sneer beneath an arbitrator's helmet for their degraded natures perhaps, but nothing more.
But let a stone thrown in that brawl miss its mark and bruise the cheek of a humble administratum functionary who's been trudging past with a satchel full of replacement stylus nibs, and then the courthouse gates will grind open for the blocks of armoured arbitrators to march out. The detectives and verispecs will track the brawlers, and Emperor have mercy on the stone thrower when the chasteners drag them into a cell beneath the courthouse to begin their punishment. Human life has no intrinsic value in Imperial law. Obedience is what it enshrines overall.
A year later, in 2012, Forge World released an event-only Imperial Enforcer with Cybermastiff. This model has loads of character. Rather than a teeny robo-dog, the Cybermastiff is a lot bulkier, and I really like the handler's apron. But no rules were ever supplied, and it's not totally sure if this is meant to be an arbitrator or a local enforcer. That's the last model we get for a while. The Arbiters continue to pop up in the odd Black Library book. One of the Carcharodon's novels is set on a prison planet staffed by arbitrators, and a few show up in the Watchers of the Throne series. But in these novels, they're generally confined to being hapless victims waiting for the real protagonists to show up. Finally, after the re-release of Necromunda, we get another Book of Judgment in 2019, accompanied by the Palanite Enforcers. Like before, these are Helmor's local law enforcement, but they're really distinct from the Adeptus Arbites, both visually but also in-game, where they run kind of like any other corrupt gang. They're probably a subject for a different video. So that's the Adeptus Arbites in 40k. I don't ever expect to see Games Workshop make these a full playable army. I've been running them as counts as for years. But I hold out hope they make their way back onto the table in some form, maybe as an extra in an Inquisition Codex. Thanks for watching. See you next time.